David Fincher's 1999 adaptation of Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club has taken on new politicized meanings in the modern day. Speaking from the year 2020, we have seen so much in the media over the last 2 decades about domestic terror attacks, and it always leads people to the question, why? How could anyone have any desire to cause such death and destruction to innocent civilians and the world at large? I think part of the reason is that many of these terrorists are looking for some kind of purpose to their life, and wrongly assume that causing death and destruction is somehow a more purposeful existence than living a life where you die for nothing. Martyrdom just means dying for a cause, yet we usually think of it in a positive light, like dying for something that you know is right and virtuous. But people who commit acts of atrocity also use the same definition of martyrdom, and genuinely believe that they are in the right while others are wrong. But it's not so simple, because people do not just go from a regular civilian to full-blown terrorist overnight. There's a gradual transition to becoming an extremist, known as radicalization. And lately, we have seen radicalization and martyrdom within the now infamous Incel community. However, we also see this in Fight Club as the narrator, played by Edward Norton, slowly goes from regular office worker who is content to simply buy furniture to terrorist bomber that is trying to erase credit card debt in an attempt to equalize society, also known by his alter ego, Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt. And to look at how people can become radicalized and eventually cause destruction, I want to use Fight Club as a template for the Incel movement so we can see more clearly someone's entire character arc into becoming a radical. Now, I'm not saying the Incel movement was started by the movie Fight Club or anything like that, but Fight Club does offer a glimpse into how ordinary people can gradually go down this radical rabbit hole and eventually commit irrevocable acts of terror. So in this episode of ThoughtTime, I'll be dividing this episode into 3 parts: the parallels of Incels and Fight Club, the process of radicalization and martyrdom, and my final thoughts and conclusions.
Hey, come on. I'm in pain.
You want to see pain? Swing by First Methodist Tuesday nights. See the guys with testicular cancer. That's pain.
I see a lot of parallels between Incels and the members of Fight Club. For those who don't know, Incel stands for involuntary celibate and is a subculture on the internet dedicated to people, typically men, sharing their experiences of trying to find intimacy. Now, this movement started out innocently enough, and actually was started by a Canadian woman named Alana in 1993, with a website called Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project. Her intent was to create an inclusive community where people of all genders and sexual orientations could talk about how something like their shyness or mental illnesses made a sexual or romantic partnership difficult for them. However, Alana eventually became a lot more comfortable with her identity and no longer felt the need to participate in her forum, so she handed off her website to a stranger. Since then, other incel websites have sprung up and even spread to forums such as 4chan and Reddit, but now with a darker, more self-loathing and misogynist tone. What we now think of as the Incel movement is mostly a cult of men on forums with their own lexicon of words that struggle with their masculinity, mental illnesses, bodies, etc., and simultaneously desire women while also dehumanizing them and wishing for their death. Many of the members of the Incel community seem to be all talk, but of course, in recent years there have been several high-profile and well-documented cases where Incels have actually put their radical ideology into violent action, such as the infamous Elliot Rodger in Santa Cruz, the 2020 Toronto machete attacks, and the deadly van attack of Alex Manassian, to name a few. So how does this movie relate to Fight Club? Well, where do I begin? I think just like how Alana started her forum to improve her life and explore various ideas surrounding her sexuality and loneliness, so too did the narrator with Fight Club in his desire to explore his masculinity and his role in life. However, while both groups start out as just places to freely discuss ideas, they eventually become these vitriolic hive minds. I'm sure many people looking for relationship advice are totally normal everyday people when they walk into the Incel forums, but by the time they are quote-unquote red-pilled with the idea that they never have a chance with women, that they are worthless and women are horrible, etc., they eventually become shells of themselves. The narrator in this film starts as more or less normal, other than his case of insomnia, but eventually devolves into this psychopath hell-bent on destroying the current status quo. Speaking of the narrator, this film also coincidentally represents a lot of the iconic terms that incels have popularized, such as alpha, beta, Chad, Stacy, etc. The narrator could be seen as a typical beta male by incels. He is weak, skinny, trapped in a subordinate position, and sexually deprived. In contrast, Tyler represents the typical alpha male, or Chad, a strong, free-willed, and sexually dominant man with a jawline you could crack an egg on. He is able to sleep with Marla, who is not a typical Stacy in the world of incels, but still seen as a woman that is an object of desire. Now, of course, the fact that Tyler is technically the same person as the narrator may present some problems with this comparison, but still opens up some interesting discussion into how incels view other men. It seems incels hold this hypocritical worldview that hypermasculine men are the only ones that are successful, powerful, sexual, etc., and therefore are bad. Yet, they still desire to become them so they can be on top. We see how the narrator and Tyler go around criticizing things like Calvin Klein underwear and asking, "Is this what a man is?" While the narrator essentially worships Tyler's similar archaic views of masculinity, such as aggression and indifference to emotions. On one hand, incels, much like feminists, seem highly keen on gender roles and how they can be harmful to individuals. But on the other hand, they do nothing to change or influence gender roles. All they can do is hate on them and feel self-loathing for not possessing whatever trait they deem desirable, such as pointy jawlines, big wrists, or head angles, whatever that even means. And you know, Tyler would say that all these masculine gender roles and self-loathing would be the result of a generation of men raised by women. Incels use this theory known as Hypergamy, which essentially states that women tend to mate with men above their current social status, which makes it so a minority of upper-class men are offered a plethora of romantic suitors to choose from, while lower-status men are left with no options. And trust me, I'm really trying to sound class here instead of stooping to their vernacular. But basically, what I'm trying to say here is that Tyler would say that women dictate with their choice of partner how men behave and present themselves. But what Tyler and incels both fail to see is that it's not usually women vocally reinforcing these harmful traits. It's usually men within that community reinforcing these ideals to other men. I think ContraPoints makes a great point about incels in her video about them, in which she discusses how they obsess about their wrist size, but do women really even consciously or unconsciously care about that? I think often the men in both communities mistake some of the traits that make men attractive to women while ignoring what a woman may actually be interested in. I mean, some of the positive traits that Tyler possesses that probably make him of interest to Marla, for example, are the fact that he is charming, a good listener, and well, just flat out interesting. In comparison, the narrator is just a monotonous, boring man who substitutes things like talent and hobbies for furniture from IKEA. Surely, it isn't the fault of women that he lives a life that is unfulfilling when he could easily change to a career that he finds more interesting, or even get a hobby to give his life more purpose or even make some new friends. The narrator as well as incels are master critics of culture and people, but they do not actually change from within at all and rely on the mocking of others just to build themselves up, just as Tyler thinks the collapse of society would make society more equal and thus make him stronger by default. Moving on, we also see how the deeper someone goes into this radical ideology, the harder it is to get out. Incels create a worldview that makes life seem hopeless for other incels, and then on top of that, they constantly criticize and belittle each other, thus making incels afraid of actual self-improvement or change, relegating themselves into the mire of the toxic incel community. Similarly, the narrator basically renounces all his material possessions and his lifestyle for the members of Fight Club, and even when he does try to leave, he tells the members to basically cut his balls off, thus ensuring he can never escape no matter how radical or outrageous the group becomes. This sort of reminds me of the phenomenon known as crab mentality, or the theory of crabs in a bucket, in which when one crab tries to escape a bucket, the other crabs will literally drag it down to ensure it is stuck with them. Of course, incel forums are support groups for men seeking intimacy, but as soon as someone actually achieves any sort of intimacy, they are now exiled by the community as a Chad or normie, instead of feeling admiration for one of their own. In the same way, many of the men choose to join Fight Club seemingly as a way to reclaim masculinity, and it seems like many of them do feel more confident and masculine after, but nevertheless, even if they want to leave and go back to the real world, their balls would be cut off, which would ultimately make them lose part of their masculinity. It highlights how the goals of many of these types of groups are malicious and selfish, rather than nice. And speaking of nice, incels often get labeled by outsiders by the ironic term nice guys, or a guy that thinks he is nice and complains that women are not into him romantically. but ironically only struggles romantically because he believes he is entitled to sex. We see this a lot with incels, as they seem to really view themselves as the protagonists of their own lives, and view their lives as more important. The narrator also comes across this way, completely ignoring or belittling Marla at times, while expecting her to always be by his side. Both incels and Fight Club are a clear case of protagonist syndrome taken to extremes, where you think you are the main character in life and everything else in life is actively against you. So how exactly does the narrator go from the person that is questioning his job and masculinity to eventually organizing a horde of men to orchestrate terrorist acts? Well, the movie does a decent job of showing the slow, hectic descent into a process known as radicalization that we will be analyzing next.
Please don't do this.
I'm not doing this. We are doing this. This is what we want.
No, I don't want this.
Fight Club is a film rife with death and destruction. We see hopeless characters such as the narrator and Bob trudge through their vacant lives where things only seem to get worse. These characters fill their lives with mundane jobs, materialism, desperate support groups, or anything else that they can throw themselves away to. Afraid to die in vain, they long for a cause to give their death a purpose. And so, they eventually fall victim to Tyler, who does in fact give them a cause to die for, albeit by manipulating them slowly through a process known as radicalization. And you know, just like the members of Fight Club, the incel community is a community of people that have kind of lost hope in life, and need some kind of explanation for where it went wrong and what they can do to reclaim their life. While the Incel Wiki tries to make it clear that incels are not a movement or community and just a life circumstance, I think many in the group have politicized it and have given it agendas far greater than simply discussing their struggling life circumstances. And sure, a majority of the members are just all talk, but the fact that so much of the discussion involved in incel forums does affect people's views of the world, and has influenced actions which have directly affected the lives of others, makes it a little bit more than just a life disposition, in my opinion. Now, we often may assume that extremists are trained or brainwashed by one person in particular, but incels do not really have a clear central leader, unlike Fight Club where Tyler is clearly the brains of the operation. But according to Clark McCauley and Sofia Masalenko, there are individual level factors that lead one down the path of radicalization, meaning people can actually brainwash themselves. So let's start by examining a handful of these individual level factors that led the narrator as well as members of the incel community down the path of radicalization and eventual martyrdom. Unfreezing is when people lose or become isolated from their friends and family, and they may start to be more open to identifying more with groups based on socio-political factors such as politics, race, or gender. Bob mentions that he has 2 kids that don't contact him anymore, and combined with his recent surgery and change in hormones, he develops this fascination with identifying with men. Of course, it starts off innocently enough by him attending support groups for men, but Tyler eventually is able to manipulate his desire for belonging to a male group and encourages him to be in this boys club. Tyler's Fight Club does seem to be about some kind of call to traditional masculinity at first, but it really is a child's view of masculinity where guys are allowed to beat each other up and not wear shirts, rather than some kind of scholarly club where men examine masculinity and various issues that come with being a male. Tyler is able to frame the club as something more innocuous, such as a club that is just about men being men, to first attract men that struggle with their masculinity, in order to then slowly indoctrinate them into this more radical, anarchistic ideology. Of course, incels are often lonely individuals that keep their use of the forums private due to their shame of being alone. So essentially, they are left on their anonymous little island where everyone can speak their mind about anything. It may start as people looking for a sense of community, but eventually it devolves into a club where no one has any perspective on anything anymore because none of them are living in the real world. And this slow, incremental change in mindset is exactly what I'll talk about next, the individual level radicalization factor known as the slippery slope. The idea is to start by giving members small tasks, and keep giving them bigger and bigger tasks that allow them to fully bloom into the ideology, while further distancing themselves from society with the activities. We see this with the various homeworks that Tyler gives to the Fight Club attendees, in which they are tasked with committing various minor forms of mischief. Spraying someone with a hose as they walk down the sidewalk isn't technically illegal, but the act is anathema to a class-based materialistic society. By committing these small anti-societal acts, they slowly distance themselves from the world, which prevents any possibility of engaging in other people's viewpoints. The narrator comes to work with a black eye, a blemish that causes his coworkers to distance themselves from him due to his clear nonconformity with the system. However, the narrator wears it like a badge of honor, showing he is going deeper and deeper into his own worldview. There's also an additional element of a sunk cost here with the slippery slope. You see, even if a member starts having second thoughts or doubts about the movement they are a part of, they do not want to feel like they have wasted their time, money, or energy on something that was evil, or else they would feel like a fool. We see this a little bit with the narrator during the scene where Tyler tries to castigate Bob in front of the house. The narrator feels it is wrong that Tyler is hazing the new members like some kind of college fraternity, but when he sees Bob leaving, he can't bring himself to allow him to leave. The narrator is already starting to see the cracks in this new system he has become a part of, and unbeknownst to him has formed, but instead of turning Bob away, he reveals to him Tyler's tricks so he can eventually join and help their cause. Often with incels, it may start with agreeing with one idea that you find relatable in the world. Like maybe you had an experience where you had a date with a woman and she said you were nice, but the relationship didn't progress. Incels are able to take some of your pre-existing worldviews and do what is called red pilling you, which attempts to show you how what you already know is only a small part of the greater truth about women and the world at large. And just like a conspiracy theory, they are introduced to more and more ideas, creating this synchronistic story of how everything is working against them. Incels may feel this sense of confidence or intelligence with their newfound worldview, which only leads them deeper and deeper to uncovering quote-unquote truths, which really just end up being pacifiers to their isolated world. And if an incel were to reform and try to leave, well, they would just feel absurd and ridiculous to ever admit that they were part of something so, well, cringy. So what other choice do they have but to keep going down this rabbit hole? Additionally, one of the more interesting risk factors for radicalization is a concept known as risk and status. Essentially, risky and dangerous behavior is rewarded as it is seen as dedication to the cause. Tyler gives the men of Fight Club a taste of this risk-reward system by making a rule that if it is your first time in Fight Club, you have to fight. So you immediately get that feedback of praise for high-risk behavior whether you win or lose. The actual Fight Club in Fight Club acts as a training ground for people to numb themselves to things like fear and pain, so when they have to venture out into the world and cause destruction and face authority, they already know what to expect and do not flinch at facing the consequences from society if they fail, but rather they think about the reward from their leader if they succeed. We see this later as the blonde member played by Jared Leto gets praise from Tyler after their mission at the gala, while leaving the narrator behind when he criticizes it for being insane. In this way, we get a glimpse into how extremists can potentially view their actions like a game. The higher the score of destruction, the more approval you get from your peers. We can see this exact thing in the incel community where the far fringes of the community idolize those that commit murder in the name of their cause. For example, Elliot Rodger, who is revered as a hero and martyr for doing what many incels fantasize about doing, where he killed 6 and injured 14 people in Santa Cruz. And let's be clear here, although the incel wiki says he barely used the term incel himself, he clearly was and was acting in the collective interest of them. And by doing the horrible and senseless deed, he finally gets the attention and name recognition that he always sought out. It is much like how in Fight Club, members regain their name and identity after they die, because it is one way to reward people by showing them that you will get recognition for helping the agenda, even if the consequences are severe, like your life. We see this specifically with Bob, who was shot by a security guard while conducting one of Tyler's projects. And at a certain point, it is hard to know for sure if extremists are committing the act because they genuinely think it is helping the greater cause, or if they are just willing to do anything that the group tells them to do to win approval. Do they genuinely think killing women is going to somehow empower men or teach women a lesson of some sort? We can see this in the police interview with the Canadian incel Alec Manassian, who drove a truck into a crowd of people. In the police interrogation, we see the interrogator ask Alec the following.
So is it fair to say you've got Chads and Stacy's up here, Normies down here, and then you've got celebs who believe that they are being repressed? Incels, sorry.
Yes.
Incels who believe they're being suppressed or repressed,
yes.
and so as a result, to even the playing field.
Yes.
They convert the Stacys and Chads from living to dead and to
so
make
that
it,
we come out on top.
In essence, we see Alec genuinely believes he has helped his cause here, as he essentially has helped narrow the gap between his perceived lower class status as an incel and the upper class statuses of alphas. During this entire interview, he shows little remorse for his actions, and he most likely is indifferent to his perceived outside image, as he knows his fellow incels will be worshipping him for years to come. And plus, these terrorists essentially rely on the all publicity is good publicity logic, as they're just happy to see their name and face in the media to feel acknowledged. So they do feel this incentive of risk and reward when they commit these acts. For some incels, martyrdom becomes a method of finally finding some recognition and purpose in their lives, and gamifying death and destruction gives them the motivation they need to get that approval. And as is the case with many terrorists after they commit their act of terror, they turn the gun on themselves and commit suicide, as was the case with Elliot Rodger. This, in effect, cements their martyrdom within their respective community, as not only did they accomplish their goals, but they did not have to face any consequences for their actions. It also creates a legacy for them that members of the community can, as bad as it sounds, aspire to be like or impose their own ideas and mythology into the terrorist. And to people who are already extremely depressed and on the edge of life and death, it can make suicide seem fashionable. As Chuck Palahniuk writes in one of his other books, Survivor, the only difference between a suicide and a martyrdom really is the amount of press coverage. And these are just a handful of the individual level factors that can lead one down the path of radicalization. Now, let's discuss some of the group level factors. So, as we all know, being in a group can influence our thoughts and actions. Often, in a group type of setting, it may be hard to criticize or disagree with arguments or ideas, especially when 99% of the group believes one thing, and you are the only one left defending your side. This essentially is the factor known as polarization, when members of a group must go further and further to one side to defend their ideas. In Fight Club, there really is no middle ground for any type of discussion. You are either with Tyler or against him. It is similar with the incel community. What started out as a place for regular people to get some tips about dating and then continue on with their life, eventually became a place rife with conspiracy and misogyny. I'm sure a lot of incels started leaving the incel community when they started noticing this increasing trend of misogyny, because they realized, well, it was bad. But that only gave the hateful incels more of a voice and steered the group farther and farther down a darker path. Next, we have the group radicalization factor known as isolation. Now, this one is pretty self-explanatory. If you were the only one in one group, then what people think of you in the group is pretty important, as you would be completely alone if you were kicked out of the group. This leads people to give more power to radical ideas, as they do not want to get disapproval from their only social group. So, as Tyler keeps proposing crazier and crazier ideas and objectives, the group is forced to conform to these ideas or risk being exiled. With the incel community, people will eventually find themselves so indoctrinated with these radical worldviews that anyone that self-proclaims to be an incel while offering more moderate ideas, such as self-improvement, is immediately lambasted and branded as another normie. Eventually, the incel community will make you so toxic that no other community or group would ever accept you if you were kicked out of the incel community. And the last group level factor for radicalization we have is competition. This is when a group thinks it must compete against other groups for legitimacy, and will become more and more radical in an effort to outdo the other group. In Fight Club, the average Joe workers and citizens of the world do not really view themselves as a group. They can be seen just going about their day, minding their own business. However, the members of Fight Club have this idea that they are somehow this oppressed minority group that must do whatever they can to gain dominance over regular society in order for their ideology to become more mainstream. We see the same thing in the incel community, where incels claim that alphas, who are basically just regular citizens, are actively doing all these evil things to deliberately sabotage the innocent beta males, and they have to resort to violence to gain some sense of voice or legitimacy. However, the reality is, it is not a competition between two factions. There is no defined community of alpha males, and people like this certainly do not pay attention or obsess about dating like incels do. Incels are trying to create a competitive dynamic between them and the rest of male society in order for them to have a tangible goal where they can win, except no one wins when they murder innocent civilians, not the incels or the victims. So now we can see how people eventually end up becoming radicalized through the various individual and group level factors as proposed by Macaulay and Moselenko, and how Fight Club offers an interesting glimpse into the transition that someone can go through into becoming a radical. And what do we make of all this information, and what can we do to stop these radicalized incels?
Marla. The little scratch on the roof of your mouth that would heal if only you could stop tonguing it, but you can't.
So, I just want to start my concluding thoughts by saying I genuinely love the movie Fight Club. I don't want anyone to think that I'm making this video to say Fight Club is a bad piece of art, or promotes radical politics, or some kind of guide to starting a radical group. In fact, I think most people realize this is just a good film that has some dark elements, but people don't really idolize Tyler or want to replicate any of the deeds committed in the film, at least for the most part. I mostly wanted to make this video because I think it is far too easy now, especially with the advent of the internet, to fall into the trap of radicalization. Now, remember, radicals exist on a spectrum. A murderer is on the farthest extremes of the radicalization process, but even someone just dabbling in online forums can be called a radical. You can be radicalized in a million different things now, from becoming an anti-vaxxer to destroying 5G cell towers, all because you wanted to learn about something that you didn't really know that much about. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, joining a group or learning about something you didn't know about will start changing you and changing your mind. This, of course, is a good thing. However, it becomes a problem when we start becoming part of a hive mind and start losing our ability to think critically, or struggle to find any middle ground or nuances in an issue. This is what made me think of incels so much when I rewatched Fight Club for the 1000th time. I really do believe most incels start as young, clueless men that are looking for any dating advice to help them navigate the confusing and uncertain world of romantic relationships. But somewhere along the way, they got lost in this cult and quickly go down this rabbit hole and change their entire worldview. But in order to find a solution to the incel problem and prevent future acts of terrorism by some of these individuals, we do have to understand the process of how they became radicalized in the first place. And that does involve humanizing them and recognizing their motivations in some way. We cannot fall into the trap of otherizing them by simply ignoring them and leaving them to their own devices. They will only become more insulated and radicalized within their echo chamber if we think this problem will just go away on its own. They still walk the same streets we do, even if we do not immediately recognize a radical incel when we see one. I mean, who would have thought Elliot Rodger would commit such an atrocity if you saw him in public? These people need real psychiatric help and counseling, as the damage done to their self-esteem and view of the world is too far gone for advice like just be happy or things will get better or anything of that nature. And look, I myself cannot offer any real tangible solutions, but I hope through this video I can open your eyes to how these people do not live in a vacuum. Like the men in Fight Club, these people start out just like any of us and go down a path in life where they think they will find the answers but only end up being more blinded. When we learn about radicalization, we can avoid going down similar paths in life and try to pull people out of harmful ideologies by showing them the absurdity of their ways. The truth is, as hard as it is to convey to incels, despite being the protagonists of their own lives, they're still the assholes. The narrator had Marla in his life the whole time, but she constantly reminded him he is an asshole. It is not until the final scene where he sheds his asshole side by taking a bullet to his mouth does he regain the affection of Marla and a better understanding of himself. And that hard truth that incels need to realize is that they need to change if they want a romantic partner in their life, but that change does not involve hatred or even outdated ideals of masculinity. They need to change their views about what respect and understanding other human beings really means. Because at the end of the day, destruction isn't just a display of physical damage, it also shows a fragile and broken mind, desperate for some love and affection. Thank you guys so much for watching another episode of ThoughtTime. I have a full-time job now that is keeping me really busy, so expect a slower rollout of these episodes, but I definitely will keep making them whenever I have some spare time. If you want to show some support, feel free to subscribe or join the discussion in the comment section. I will do my best to respond if you have any questions or anything you want to discuss with me personally. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.